Positive energy all the time. Good to see you all. And this is something I need to document for historical purposes because this is always said, and this is totally incorrect. It's always said that Jesse Jackson created the term African American. That is 1,000,000,000% incorrect. That's incorrect. That's not true. So we're going to get into it. And trust me, I know. So let's document that, get that documented. I'm representing Chicago, Illinois. Shout out to everybody on Facebook, Kick, Twitch, and YouTube. Both Facebook accounts. Much love to both of the accounts. Rep your city, rep your city. We got Greensboro here. We always show love to the cities. Always show love to the cities. That's what we do here. We make sure we show love to the cities. Why not? That's where we take care of our family. That's where we have our relationships. That's where we work. That's where we live. That's where we eat. That's where we lay our head to rest. So this is always misinformation. It's total misinformation that Jesse Jackson created the term African American. It's just unbelievable that people are saying that. It's crazy. And I don't think these people would hear, to be honest. Then some of these people, they might be from small cities. I'm in Chicago, born and raised, 1958. Operation Breadbasket was the original organization for Jesse Jackson. Then it became Operation Push. Okay. Hit that like button, share, subscribe. Come on in. We're going to get into this. We're going to get into this. Now, there's a reason people say Jesse Jackson created it, and that's because he was saying it the most. But he did not create it. And there's a reason he was saying it the most. And all of that's got to do with where it was created at. The term African American was never created for us to call ourselves. That's not how the term was used. The term was not a term that we actually were supposed to use. Okay? The term African American was never a term for us to use. So let some people get in here so they won't be behind. We've only been here 12 minutes. We'll wait about 30 minutes and we'll get into the conversation. But the term was not, or I might just jump into it. They just got to go rewind this. The term was never a term for us to use. The term African American. It was never a term that was made for us to describe ourselves. So for those of you up here early, I'll give you the early, I'll tell you the early, and then we'll go back and we'll cover it when more people go over here. Come over here. The term African American was strictly a news media and documentary term. It was a news media term. The term African American was a news media term. The news media created that term. Not Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson just used it a lot because Jesse Jackson was where all the time? In the news media. So Jesse Jackson used the term that the news media was using. Now, this is all going to make sense. You just have to relax and listen to it. Okay? He used the term, Michael, because he was in the news. He was on the news media. He got the term from the news media. He did not make that up. It was a news media term. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have social media. So people like Jesse Jackson, every time they was spoke or anytime we ever got to see them, it would have to be on WGN News, CBS News, ABC News, or NBC News. So he used the term African American because it was a news media term. Okay? It's very important for you to know this, Michael, so you know the real history. And I am 67 years old. I was here. So you ask, well, Pharaoh, why was the term created? In the late 50s and in the 60s, the United States, especially big cities like especially New York and Chicago. New York and Chicago were the two biggest cities. You want to listen, Michael, or what do you want to do? What do you want to do? What you want to do, Michael? You want to listen? Because that's wrong information. I got to delete that because black wasn't even created yet. So how could you say stick with black when black came later? Okay, let me delete that. He says stick with black, and black was after African American. This is what I'm talking about. Shh, listen. How can you stick with something when African American was before black? And what do you mean stick with something? So for those of y'all that want to listen, if I got people that interrupt and disrupt y'all in the chat, I'm a silence them, okay? Because y'all, I want y'all to learn, and I don't want distractions to throw y'all off, right? While I break the history down to you. In the United States, the biggest cities at that time were Chicago and New York. And Chicago and New York was still full of large immigrant populations. And so in the early 60s on through to the 70s, New York and Chicago had ethnic neighborhoods. So you had Little Italy, you had Chinatown, you had Germantown. And because these immigrants had came here, they hadn't begun to mix yet. So mostly a Polish neighborhood was all Polish, and a young Polish man would marry a young Polish woman. So they stayed Polish. An Italian man would marry an Italian woman, so they stayed Italian. It wasn't until you get more towards the 80s and 90s where an Italian man might marry a German woman, and that's when they became white, when they mixed. But when you go back to the 60s and in the early 70s, there was specific ethnic groups. So when the news media would come on the news media to tell a story about ethnic groups, they would say Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Polish Americans, German Americans. And for the sake of the news, they needed a term for us. They couldn't identify a country because, mind you, white Americans don't know any of this history that we know too. So you can't take for granted that whites knew something and said something nobody knew the information we know now, including whites. Whites were just as informed on as misinformed on the history of us. Whites didn't know nothing about slavery like that. If you was a white man in New York or Chicago, what the hell you know about slavery? So in order to tell the news, to describe everybody, to describe Italian American, German American, Polish American, they couldn't give us Nigeria. They couldn't give us Ethiopia. So they said, let's call them African American. The term African American was a news term only used for ethnic stories about various ethnic groups of Americans. That's where it came from. The term African American, we didn't get that based on us. We got that based on German Americans, based on Italian Americans, based on Greek Americans, based on Polish Americans. So now they'll identify you as African American. It was an add-on term to be added on with the other ethnic Americans for the sake of the news to describe the different ethnic groups. So if they're going to talk about an Italian restaurant, they're going to say, well, you can go get some great Italian American food. If they're going to talk about a soul restaurant, they're going to say, so you could go get what? Some great African American food. That's what it was used for. It was for the news. It wasn't for the streets. Italians did not call themselves Italian Americans. They just called themselves Italians. The news called them Italian Americans when describing their neighborhood or their food or something. So all the groups that American was put on there by the news media. Polish people never called themselves Polish Americans. The news media called them Polish Americans, Italian Americans, German Americans, if you lived in Germantown, and called us African Americans. This was strictly for the description of people for the news media. And if the news media is using the term African American and Jesse Jackson is on the news, what term is he going to use? He's going to use the proper what? News term, which is African American, which is not the only term he used, because if he's talking about an Italian neighborhood, Jesse Jackson also would say Italian Americans. Jesse Jackson would also say Chinese Americans. If he's on the news and he's describing Chinese, he's going to call them Chinese Americans. This is in the 60s and through the 70s. This is how Americans were described: by your ethnic group, right? And your citizenship. You're an Italian, but you're an American citizen. So you're an Italian American. They say you're African, but you're an American citizen. So African American. Because they did know some little bit about slavery, but not much. Just because somebody was dealing with slavery in the early 1800s don't mean nobody in 1970 knew too much about it, to be honest with you. Because education didn't cover that. Education in the 40s, 50s, and 60s covered reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's it. Didn't cover all that. It didn't cover slavery and all that. You didn't have to learn that in school. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's it. Maybe when you start getting the 5th or 6th grade, you might get geometry, but you ain't getting no ethnic information. That's new stuff. So a lot of times when you're new and you're in this generation, you're thinking everything back then was like it is for you now. So that's the only reason you're confused, because you can't imagine what life was like in 1965. You think it's like it is now, but it's not. So the term African American is a news term to describe Black people that are American citizens. Italian American is used to describe Italian people that are American citizens. Polish American was used to describe Polish people that are American citizens. After so long, whites began to mix and they lost their ethnic groups and they were no longer Polish and Italian, they just became white. They eventually became white. By the time you get to 90s and 2000, they had mixed. You know, you're Greek, your son's Greek, you and his mother's Greek, but he go to college, he fall in love with a Polish lady. He fall in love with who he fall in love with and have a baby. And now that baby is no longer Greek. That baby's half Greek, half Polish. That baby's white now. So that's how white became a use as white Americans began to mix. As their sons and daughters began to fall in love with who they fell in love with. There's whole documentaries in Chicago about the loss of Greek restaurants, the loss of Italian restaurants, the loss of Polish restaurants, because as whites got to mix, they lost the Polish, they lost the Italian, they lost the Greek, and they just became white. I think one of the few things that's surviving is the Italian restaurants is one of the few survivors. In the 70s, we still had the Greek restaurants where we would go get the original gyro. When I was in 7th grade, 8th grade, we would ride down to Newtown and get the gyro from the real Greek restaurant where they got the lamb and that thing was good too. If you're a meat eater, oh man. Those began to disappear as Europeans began to mix outside of their country heritage. So the fact that we got called African American longer than everybody else because we didn't mix. We the only ones stay true to it, baby. They was no longer Greek Americans. They was white. They was no longer Italian Americans. They was white because the Italian guy married the Polish girl or married the Jewish girl or married the German lady. But we only married ourselves. So we was the last group standing. We're the last group in America that's still the same way we was since we've been in this country. We haven't mixed out. Everybody else mixed out. We didn't, because everybody else was white or Asian or Hispanic, and they didn't really want to mix with us like that anyway. So we just stayed the same. We just stayed African American. It wasn't a term that they actually just used just to identify you to Africa. It was just a term to make you be able to match the other people. That's all. It wasn't nothing personal to it. They just wanted to make us sound just like Chinese American. They wanted us to be able to sound like Italian. The news wanted to sound professional. And so African American was very professional at that time. It was a perfect term, actually. It was a great term in the way it was used. In the way it was used, it was perfect. It just doesn't make sense now because they don't use Polish American term no more. You don't hear that. You don't hear Polish American, Irish American, Italian American, Greek American. You don't hear that. German American. You don't hear that anymore. So when you hear African American, it just sounds weird to you. But if you heard that along with all the other people, then you go, oh, I get it. So it was just a descriptive term. It wasn't a term for us to be called. It wasn't meant to call people Italian Americans. They just call themselves Italian. We just call ourselves Black. None of the people use those terms. Only politicians and stuff use those terms. Yes, I'm running for mayor. I'm here to represent the Italian American community. You see what I'm saying? That was for the news media. So that's why they put it on Jesse Jackson, because Jesse Jackson was one of the main black people on the news. So he was the one using it because he talking about us all the time. So because he's talking about us all the time, what is he saying? African American, African American, African American, African American, because he's not talking about Polish American. He's not talking about Greek Americans. So it made us like stand out with the term. But it was never a singular term to be used singularly like that. It was always a term used in the midst of everybody else's description. It was meant to be used when you say Polish American, Italian American, Chinese American, African American. It flowed for the news media. The news media needed something to say. They needed a way to describe you, and they wanted to make sure that it matched everybody else. It wasn't nothing negative. They wanted us to sound just like German American. German American, African American, Italian American, Greek American, Polish American. That's all it was. It wasn't no insult. It was nothing degrading. It was just strictly the news. But this idea that Jesse Jackson made that up, that's nonsense. Jesse Jackson didn't make that up. That was strictly news talk. So you say, what do you mean news talk? I'll give you an example. We say, man, it's about to rain. What do the weather say? Precipitation. You know what I'm saying? African American is like the word precipitation. We just use rain. We just black. But the news can't say black. They got to juice it up. So they say African American community. This great African American cuisine. Think about it. It sounds great. African American cuisine sounds better than black cuisine. In terms of the news. And Jesse Jackson, they trying to stick it on him because he was in the news. And because he was in the news and he was using it, they trying to stick it on him. But he was using the term the news used. That's not his term. He was using the professional term that was being used on the news. He did not make that up. He didn't make that up. And nobody called themselves that. We didn't call ourselves African Americans. We didn't call ourselves African Americans. Italians didn't call themselves Italian Americans. Polish people didn't call themselves Polish Americans. They just Polish. In the neighborhoods, they call them Polacks. You know? No groups use that. Only their spokespeople use that. No groups use that title themselves. That was strictly a media title. Italians did not call themselves Italian Americans. Greeks didn't call themselves Greek Americans, or Polish people didn't call themselves Polish Americans. When a senator or an alderman get on there, he say, I'm here to represent the Polish American community. That's a political news term. Y'all with me? Y'all understand what I'm saying? If you say it over, it'll make sense. You're like, yeah, you're right. African American, that's some news stuff. Nobody call themselves that in the street or nothing like that. And farms used to have that on there. But it was too much, and then as white started mixing, they just put white. But at one time, you had to tell what type of white. You couldn't just say white. You had, what are you, Italian? What are you? Because everybody was just mixing with their own originally, and they lived in neighborhoods that was just them. America, the neighborhoods was just that. Everybody lives amongst their own. Germantown was really Germantown. It's Germans. And when you come from Germany, you move to Germantown, where a German is rent you a place to live. You come from Italy, you move to Little Italy. You come from China, you move where? To Chinatown. We outnumbered those small groups because we had lost our culture through slavery and Jim Crow and all that. So it was more of us than it was Italians. It was more of us than it was Polish. The only way they would have more than us is if they just call themselves white. If they white, they'll have more people than us. But they groups didn't. There wasn't more Chinese Americans than African Americans. There wasn't more Italian Americans than African Americans. There wasn't more Polish Americans. It was a whole bunch of African Americans. It was a whole bunch of us came from the South in the Great Migration. Oh man, you should have seen it. So in order to compete with our numbers, it also was beneficial for them to be white. Like, man, these black people, so a lot of them, we're going to have to be white. But that's not really the reason they did it. They did it because people fall in love with who they fall in love with. And as young white men fell in love, they fell in love with whatever girl they liked. So if he was an Italian boy, he didn't want to have to fall in love with an Italian girl. He wanted to be able to love any woman that he liked. And for them, it's like, well, as long as she's white, it's all right. So whites began to mix out their origin of their country, began to mix out, and they just became white. And as they became white, what did we become? We became black. It was no need to call us African Americans no more. That's why we was black. It was only a need to call us African Americans as long as they were individuals. As long as they were Italian Americans, Polish Americans, then it would make sense for us to be African American. But when they started mixing between each other and just became white, it don't make no sense to call us African American no more. So now you got to come up with something else. So you're going to say what? White Americans and what? Black Americans. It's all news media stuff. That's why black became popular. Black became popular because white became popular. These are the facts. All this stuff was organic. Wasn't like nobody was in the room. We're going to start calling ourselves African American. Okay, what we going to call ourselves? We're going to start calling ourselves black. And all this stuff happened organically. So as the whites start mixing together and start being identified as white, boom. We're like, okay, with your bad self, say it loud. I'm black and out. We became black. Okay, if you white, now we black. Now, if you're Italian American, I'm African American. If you're Polish American, I'm African American. But if y'all white, then I'm black. And that's how that happened organically. There was nobody go across the country and say, y'all, this is what we going. It didn't happen like that. All this stuff happened organically. Whites became whites because they started mixing amongst their different countries. They was no longer Italians. They was mixed. They were no longer Polish. They were no longer Irish. They white. Because the Irish guy married an Italian woman. The Italian guy married a Polish woman. The German guy married a Polish girl. They kids ain't German or Polish no more. So they started becoming white. And then we became black. All organically. All that happened organically. None of that, because it was constantly changes. Now, when you go all the way back to the South, we was Negress. Negress, like Negras. And that's because the whites wasn't that educated. So that's why they called us Negress. Because down south is close to the southern border, South America, Mexico, and they called us El Negro. El Negro. So the whites heard Negro and they said Negress. Negress became, when they mad, Nigger. But to those not mad, it became Negro. Negro come from El Negro. So it was Negro. From Negress, from El Negro to Negro. From Negro to coloreds. From coloreds, the news started saying African American, which we never picked up on it. So African American and black was both born around the same time, because we never picked up on African American. We went pretty much from color to black. We never identified ourselves as African American for anything other than professional reasons like jobs and stuff. So by the time I was 10 years old, we was black. Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. African American, we never called ourselves African American. That was a professional term for the news media or jobs and stuff like that. That was never used outside. My mother and father, they was Negroes and colors. I was born in 1958. We was black. Yeah, I was black. I wasn't ever a Negro or color. My mom and daddy was Negro and color. They born in the 30s. I'm born in 1958. By the time I got old enough to even identify, I was black. We never called ourselves African Americans. African American was a professional term. That's it. It was just a term the media used. But once they no longer had to identify Italian American, Chinese, once they didn't have to do that no more, that's when the term went away. Because the only ones that stayed the same way was the African Americans and the Chinese Americans. We was the only ones that would have been able to still use that. The whites started mixing, so they couldn't be Polish Americans no more. They couldn't be Italian or German because they all began to mix. And the only two that didn't mix was the Chinese and the blacks. But it didn't make no sense for the news to call the Chinese Americans and call us black African Americans if they didn't have no more German Americans and Polish Americans. It won't look good in writing. It won't look good in articles. You got to understand the news media, them, they got to make, it's got to sound good on the news. It's got to look good in articles. It's all got to match when they're writing it. So over time, they switched to blacks, Asians, whites. See what I'm saying? They had to throw the Chinese in there as Asians for the purpose of writing. A lot of these things, y'all, It's for the purpose of articles and news and writings to make it flow when they're writing their stories or when they're doing it. That's it. It's for the flow. So Asian, when whites were no longer German Americans and stuff, and they had to be white Americans, then you got to stop saying Chinese American, start saying Asian American, Black American, white American. See what I'm saying? So that it will flow in the news. All of this is for the news, for articles or documentaries. None of this was for the people. All of this was for the sake of professionals that got to get in front of cameras and describe us. They had to make up a way to describe us to make the news story or the documentary flow. That's how that happened. So it would flow. So it would all match. Since whites are no more German American and they just whites, we can't say whites and Chinese Americans and Black Americans. We got to change that, right? So now you got to say whites, and you're going to have to say white American. Now we're going to have to change y'all to Asian American, and we got to change y'all to Black American for the purpose of the articles, right, y'all? Are y'all riding with me? For the purpose of the article, or for the newsman, for the person doing the documentary or the movie. They changing it so it flow for them. They never changed that for the people. Jesse Jackson was only using African American for the news. It was the proper term for the news at that time. When it changed, he had to start saying Black American, Asian American, and white American. He had to change. None of this was his decision. This was professional. When we speak on media and stuff, we have to use whatever words is used in that profession. Whatever type of descriptions they use in that profession to make their news story sound professional or their documentary or whatever, their interview, then you have to use those words. That's the truth about the matter. That's all. Anybody tell you, say, no, African American was strictly a professional term for cases like documentaries, news, exposés. That's it. That's all that was for. At a time when everybody else was something American. Once they were no longer Polish American, no longer Italian American, then that's when they stopped using African American. And that's when they started using Black, because they couldn't call them Polish Americans no more and German American. They had to start calling them white Americans because they was whites that mixed. So when all these white Europeans mixed, they had to come with a new title for them. They're no longer Polish, German, or whatever. They're having babies with each other. So now they're white Americans. Okay, for the news story to flow, you got to be a Black American. You got to be an Asian American. You can't be no Chinese American no more, because it won't flow. We ain't got different kind of white people, so we ain't finna have different type of Asian people. So if you watch me, you learn something that very few people in this country know. Consider yourself put on some game. The news media created that. Jesse Jackson did not create that. That term was strictly for the media. And it changed when the media had to change it. It's that simple. You say, Pharaoh, prove to us that you have to change a word for the media. Okay, unalive. Tell me we don't got to say unalive. Why do we make up the word unalive? For YouTube, for the media. We had to make up unalive. Tell me I'm lying. Imagine somebody saying, who created unalive? Jab. We had to say jab. I had to get the jab for the news media. That's the real history, y'all. This is short and sweet. Jesse Jackson did not make up African American, but because he was talking about it so much, he said it a lot, and it made it look like he made it up because you wasn't able to hear it the way it was originally used in order with the other Americans. It was originally used when the news would say, and we have a great neighborhood, a great city of Chinese American, Polish American, German American, right? Italian American, African American. That's how it was used. But because Jesse Jackson was dealing with our issues all the time, he'd be on the news saying African American this, African American that, African American this, African American that. But the Italian mayor of New York, what was he always saying? Italian American this, Italian American that. He was saying the same thing Jesse Jackson was saying. But he was saying what? Us Italian Americans, we don't like these gangster pictures. Well, remember when the Italian American mayor in New York didn't like Scarface, didn't like The Godfather. Said it made what? Italian Americans look bad. And he used Italian American, Italian American, Italian American. He didn't make it up. He used the term that the media was using to describe Italians that are American citizens. And Jesse Jackson did the same thing. He said Italian American, Jesse Jackson said African American. And they had to switch the continent because they didn't have the country. Italy had the country they can identify. Germans had the country they can identify. Chinese had the country they could identify. We didn't. So that was smart. They said, well, let's give them the whole continent. They couldn't call us Nigerian Americans or Ethiopian Americans or Ghanaian Americans. So they say, okay, African American. It's all media. It wasn't nothing personal. You know, the show must go on. So that's the history of African American. Now you know something, spread it. People might try to argue with you. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're talking about if they're not from Chicago, if they wasn't in Chicago in the 60s and the 70s and old enough to know what's going on. They don't know what they're talking about. Me, I'm in Chicago. I went to see the Jackson 5. I went to events thrown by Operation Breadbasket. That's before it was Push. I was here. And watching, and we have a more major media. Our media is bigger than a small city. A small city don't have media like Chicago. They don't have ABC, NBC, CBS News big like Chicago. And we don't, just like our news, not big like New York. New York got 8 million people now. We only got about 2. So these big cities, you can see things differently. So I was here. I seen it. African American is a media term. Jesse Jackson did not make that up. They said he make it up because he used it a lot. Because he was a civil rights person. So he used it a lot. So they tried to say he invented it. He did not. He was using what was acceptable on the news media. And the news media made that term usable. Put that term out there. I always remember that African American, the term was created to talk about you in the list of other Americans. It was made to talk about you in the list when they mentioning Italian American, Greek American, German American, Chinese American, African American. That's what it was made for the group. It wasn't like they just named you African American. You was just another one in the group of Greek Americans, of Polish Americans. That's it. Just to be able to talk professionally on the media and have a term to use for you that matches everybody else's term. That's it. It all makes sense if you think about it. At the time they called us that, they called everybody something American. Everybody was something American. And there was certain ethnic groups that was bigger than everybody else. Polish, Germans, Greek, Italian, Chinese, African American. Wasn't a whole bunch of Mexicans. Wasn't a whole bunch of Spanish people. Wasn't a whole bunch of Mexicans or Cubans yet. So you didn't hear that much. Eventually you start hearing Puerto Rican, but by the time you got to Puerto Rican, they wasn't using American no more. They wasn't using, and they started calling them Hispanic. So it's Hispanic, Asian, all Asian, Hispanic, black, white. Basically. And then they kept fixing it, right? Non-white Hispanic. They just, they kept tinkering with it. That's the basics, though. So send this to anybody that wants to know where the term African American come from, and let them know it comes from the media, the news, documentaries, stuff like that. Jesse Jackson did not make that up. Thanks for watching. Make sure you support the channel. Super Chat, Cash App, Venmo, PayPal. Stay positive. Always stay positive, okay? Always. Always stay positive, and it don't get no realer than this. Victory.